What happens when the one person who can save a life is wrongfully taken away? A renowned surgeon, Dr. Malik Carter, is moments away from performing a life-saving surgery when he's stopped, detained, and humiliated, all because of the color of his skin. But as the clock ticks and a young man's life hangs in the balance, the revelation of Malik's true identity sends shockwaves through the police department and the entire city. What follows is a fight not just for justice, but for the soul of a system that's broken. Will he make it in time to save the life he's sworn to protect? And what will it take to bring those responsible to justice? This is a story of courage, perseverance, and the battle against a system that targets the very people it's supposed to protect. Get ready for a story that will challenge everything you think you know about power, race, and justice. Stay tuned, because this is only the beginning. Dr. Malik Carter adjusted the collar of his white coat as he stepped out of his townhouse into the bustling city streets. The morning was like any other, bright, with the sound of cars honking in the distance, and the faint hum of the city's constant motion. He breathed in deeply, savoring the crisp air mixed with the familiar scent of fresh coffee from a cafe nearby. Today, however, was not like most days. A young man was lying on a hospital bed, waiting for him. A rare condition had led to an emergency surgery, and Dr. Carter was the only one with the expertise to perform it. His presence was crucial, the life of this patient depended on him. With a glance at his watch, he quickened his pace. Malik's reputation in the medical field was unmatched. He had risen to fame as a top cardiac surgeon, pioneering techniques that had saved countless lives. But what truly set him apart was his passion for the work. For Malik, medicine wasn't just a job, it was a calling. Born into a modest family, he had worked tirelessly to overcome the hurdles society had placed before him. His mother used to tell him, "The world won't always see you for who you are, but never let that stop you from doing what you were meant to do." Those words had been a guiding force throughout his life. As he walked down the street, the world around him seemed to move in slow motion. People passed by in a rush, some heading to work, others sipping their morning coffee, and a few walking their dogs. Malik's mind, however, was focused entirely on the surgery ahead. He mentally reviewed the steps, the risks, and the delicate balance between life and death that he would soon face. Lost in thought, Malik didn't notice the two police officers approaching from the corner. They were walking toward him with purpose, their eyes fixed on his figure. He continued moving, unaware of the attention he had drawn. His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of a voice behind him. "Excuse me, sir," a gruff voice called out. Malik stopped and turned, surprised to find two uniformed officers standing just a few feet away. The taller of the two, Officer Riley, had his arms crossed, his face etched with suspicion. The other, Officer Thompson, stood slightly behind, one hand resting near his holster. Malik felt a familiar, unwelcome tension rise within him. "Yes, officer." Malik responded calmly, his hands still adjusting the cuff of his white coat. His tone was measured, polite, but wary. He had been through this before. As a black man in this city, he knew how encounters like this could go. His father had always told him to stay calm, respectful, and never give anyone a reason to escalate the situation. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Officer Riley asked, his tone accusatory. Malik blinked, taken aback by the question. "I'm on my way to the hospital," he replied, keeping his voice even. "I have surgery in less than an hour." Riley's eyes narrowed, glancing over Malik's clean-cut appearance, his white coat, his polished shoes, the stethoscope peeking out from his jacket pocket. But none of that seemed to register. All Riley saw was the color of his skin. "Mind showing me some ID?" Riley asked, though it didn't sound like a request. Malik hesitated, the familiar sense of frustration bubbling up. He hadn't done anything wrong. There was no reason for this, no reason at all. But he knew better than to argue. This was about control, about power. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. "May I ask why you need my ID?" Malik asked, doing his best to keep his tone neutral, though he already knew the answer. "We had reports of suspicious activity in the area," Riley said, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "You match the description." The words hit Malik like a punch. Suspicious activity. He had heard it all before, the veiled accusations, the assumptions, the racial profiling. But there was no time for outrage. He had a patient waiting. He needed to get to the hospital. With a sigh, Malik handed over his ID. Officer Riley glanced at the ID for a moment, his smirk never faltering. "A doctor, huh?" he said, tossing the card back to Malik. "You don't look like a doctor to me." Malik clenched his jaw, holding back the retort that sat on the tip of his tongue. He had dealt with comments like this his whole life. They never got easier, but he had learned to swallow them. "I'm a cardiac surgeon," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I'm on my way to perform an emergency surgery." Riley's smirk widened, as if he found the whole situation amusing. "A surgeon, huh? You must be real important." His tone dripped with sarcasm. "Tell you what, why don't you step away from the car while we check your ID?" Malik glanced at his watch, the seconds ticking by far too quickly. He couldn't afford to waste time. His patient didn't have time. "Officer," he said carefully, "this is a misunderstanding. I need to go. If you'll let me pass, I can be on my way, and you won't have to waste your time." But Riley wasn't listening. He nodded to Officer Thompson, who stepped closer, his hand now resting fully on his holster. "I said step away from the car," Riley repeated, his voice harder this time. Malik felt his heart rate quicken. He knew how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control. He had seen it happen too many times before. Without another word, he stepped away from the car, raising his hands slightly to show he wasn't a threat. But even as he did, he felt a knot form in his stomach. This wasn't going to end well. Malik stood still, his hands raised slightly as Officer Riley circled around him. There was an uneasy silence in the air, a kind of tension that Malik had grown all too familiar with over the years. Despite the clean white coat, the stethoscope, and the ID that clearly stated Dr. Malik Carter, MD, none of it mattered right now. Not to them. Riley's hand brushed against his belt as he walked closer, eyes still locked on Malik. His partner, Officer Thompson, stood a few steps back, his hand hovering near his gun, as though expecting Malik to suddenly turn dangerous. Malik suppressed a sigh, reminding himself to stay calm. This wasn't the time to argue, no matter how unjust it felt. "We're gonna need to search you," Riley said, his tone low but firm. Malik blinked in disbelief. "Search me? For what?" His voice was measured, but there was a sharp edge to it now. He knew the answer before Riley could say it, but the absurdity of the situation demanded some acknowledgement. "Suspicious activity," Riley replied with a shrug, as if that justified everything. "You fit the description." Malik felt the words hang in the air like a slap to the face. Fit the description. That vague, nebulous phrase that had been used for generations to justify unjust stops, searches, and arrests of black men. Malik glanced down at his polished shoes, his meticulously tailored suit, the stethoscope now dangling from his pocket. What description could possibly match this? But he didn't ask. He already knew the answer. The description was simple: black men. That's all it took. "I'm a doctor," Malik repeated, trying to keep his voice steady, despite the rising frustration. "I'm on my way to the hospital for an emergency surgery. This is a waste of time." "Yeah," Riley said, not even bothering to hide the smirk this time. "A doctor." "Sure." He took a step closer, his posture more aggressive now. "Look, this'll go a lot easier if you just cooperate. You don't want any trouble, do you?" Malik swallowed the anger that was building inside him. Trouble? No, he didn't want trouble. He never wanted trouble. But trouble had a way of finding him, no matter how far he'd come in life. The years of study, the accolades, the respect he'd earned in the medical field, none of it shielded him from this moment. From this reality. "I'm cooperating," Malik said, though his voice was tighter now. "But I need to get to the hospital." Riley exchanged a glance with Thompson, a silent conversation passing between them. Then, without warning, Riley reached out and grabbed Malik's arm, twisting it behind his back. The suddenness of the move caught Malik off guard, and pain shot up his shoulder. "Hey!" Malik protested, his body tensing instinctively. "What are you doing?" "You're resisting," Riley said flatly, though Malik hadn't moved at all. In a matter of seconds, Thompson was on him too, pushing him roughly against the hood of his car. Malik gritted his teeth, trying not to cry out from the pain shooting through his shoulder. "I'm not resisting," Malik managed to say, his voice strained. "You don't need to do this." But his words fell on deaf ears. The officers were already focused on cuffing his hands behind his back, as if Malik was some kind of threat. As if this was just another routine stop gone bad. Malik could feel the cold metal of the handcuffs bite into his wrists, and for a moment, he wondered if this was really happening. The absurdity of it all hit him like a wave. Here he was, a renowned surgeon, on his way to save a life, and now he was being treated like a criminal on the streets for simply existing in the wrong skin. His mind raced, thinking of the patient waiting for him at the hospital. Time was slipping away, and with each second, the chances of that young man surviving grew slimmer. "You're under arrest for resisting arrest," Riley said coldly, tightening the cuffs. Malik's stomach dropped at the sheer ridiculousness of the statement. He hadn't resisted anything. He had done everything they'd asked. He had tried to explain, tried to de-escalate the situation, but none of it mattered. Nearby, a few passers-by had started to gather, watching the scene unfold with looks of concern and confusion. One elderly woman, Mrs. Turner, who lived across the street, had stepped out onto her porch, her eyes wide with shock. Malik had seen her in the neighborhood before, always waving politely when they crossed paths. "Hey," she called out from her porch, her voice trembling. "What are you doing to him? He didn't do anything wrong." A young couple walking their dog had stopped as well. The man pulled out his phone, quietly recording the scene. "This is messed up," he muttered under his breath to his girlfriend. Malik caught sight of the phone, and for a brief moment, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe the footage would help later. Maybe it would show people what really happened here. But for now, it wouldn't change anything. He was powerless. The officers dragged him to the police car, ignoring the growing crowd and the murmurs of protest that were beginning to ripple through the small group of onlookers. Malik stumbled slightly as they forced him into the back seat, his body slamming against the hard interior of the car. This wasn't happening, he thought. This couldn't be happening. But it was. And as the police car pulled away from the curb, Malik turned his head to look out the window at the faces of the people watching him. He saw the confusion, the anger, the helplessness in their eyes. And just before the car disappeared from view, he managed to say one thing, his voice loud enough to carry through the thin glass of the window. "This isn't over." The words hung in the air like a promise. Like a declaration. Because deep down, Malik knew that it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the police car sped through the city streets, Malik's mind raced even faster. Every second that passed felt like a ticking clock, one that wasn't in his favor. His thoughts kept drifting back to the hospital, to the young man lying on the operating table. His condition was critical, and without Malik there to perform the surgery, the patient's chances of survival were slim. Time was running out, and the weight of that reality pressed heavily on Malik's chest. The rhythmic thrum of the car's engine and the distant sounds of the city outside did nothing to calm his nerves. He shifted uncomfortably in the back seat, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. The absurdity of the situation struck him again, but the urgency of the moment overshadowed everything else. Meanwhile, across the city at the hospital, the surgical team was beginning to panic. Nurses exchanged worried glances as they checked the clock again. Dr. Carter should have been there by now. In the operating room, the patient's vitals were dropping. His mother, Mrs. Johnson, sat in the waiting room, wringing her hands anxiously, unaware of the unfolding crisis. Dr. Emily Santos, one of Malik's colleagues, paced nervously in the hallway. She had been in surgery with Malik countless times, and while she was an excellent surgeon in her own right, this particular procedure required Malik's expertise. He had performed it dozens of times, refining the technique to a point where few in the field could match him. "Where is he?" Emily muttered under her breath as she glanced at the clock again. Her stomach twisted with anxiety. The patient, Tyler Johnson, had come in with a rare cardiac condition, one that few surgeons had the skill to operate on. Malik had been confident, as always, assuring the family that everything would be fine. But as the minutes ticked by, the hope that had filled the hospital began to wane. Emily picked up her phone and dialed Malik's number again, but there was no answer. She didn't know what to think. Malik was never late. He prided himself on his punctuality, especially in matters of life and death. Something was wrong. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps behind her. "Dr. Santos," a nurse called out, her voice tense. "We can't wait much longer. His vitals are dropping fast." Emily's heart pounded. She knew they couldn't delay the surgery any further. But without Malik, the odds of success were slim. She bit her lip, torn between starting the procedure herself or waiting just a little longer for Malik to arrive. In the waiting room, Mrs. Johnson's anxiety had begun to bubble into panic. She had been told that her son's surgery was urgent but straightforward. Dr. Carter, a man with a stellar reputation, had personally reassured her. But now, as the minutes passed with no word, fear gripped her chest. She glanced around the room, seeing other families sitting calmly, reading magazines or scrolling through their phones. How could they sit there so peacefully, unaware of the storm raging inside her? The door to the waiting room opened, and Mrs. Johnson jumped up, hoping for news. But it was only a nurse. The smile she forced for the nurse's benefit faded as the woman walked past without so much as a glance. She could feel her heart pounding, matching the rhythm of the seconds ticking away. Back in the operating room, Emily was running out of time. She made the decision. "Prep the patient," she ordered. "We're starting." The nurses quickly moved into action, and Emily's hands shook slightly as she scrubbed in. She wasn't supposed to be doing this surgery. This was Malik's procedure. She wasn't ready, but she had no choice. The patient's life depended on her now. At the same time, Malik sat helpless in the back of the police car, every fiber of his being fighting against the injustice of it all. He had done everything right, followed every rule, and yet here he was, detained for no reason other than the color of his skin. But his thoughts weren't focused on himself. All he could think about was the patient, the surgery, and how he was needed there, not here. He shifted again, his wrists aching from the tight cuffs, and shot a glance toward the front of the car. Officer Riley and Officer Thompson were sitting in silence, the hum of the police radio filling the space. They were oblivious to the chaos they had caused, to the life they were putting in danger by holding Malik here. "I need to get to the hospital," Malik said, his voice sharp but controlled. "There's a young man who's depending on me. His life is at stake." Officer Riley didn't even glance back. "Sit tight, doctor. You'll get your phone call soon enough." Malik gritted his teeth. "You don't understand. I'm a surgeon. There's a patient waiting for me. This isn't just about me, someone could die." Thompson shifted slightly, glancing toward Riley, but neither officer responded. Malik could feel his patience slipping, the frustration building inside him. He was losing time, time that could be the difference between life and death for that young man. Every second spent in the back of this police car was a second that brought the patient closer to a fatal outcome. At the hospital, Emily stood over the patient, her hands trembling as she made the first incision. The operating room was tense, the nurses exchanging anxious glances. She could hear the steady beeping of the heart monitor, but it wasn't steady enough. It was too fast, too irregular. Tyler Johnson was fading, and without Malik's expertise, Emily knew the chances of success were slim. In the waiting room, Mrs. Johnson's anxiety turned to tears. She could feel it, something wasn't right. The nurse had said the surgery would have started by now, but there was no word, no updates. She clutched her phone in one hand and her son's favorite baseball cap in the other, praying for good news, praying that Dr. Carter would come through as promised. but at that moment, Dr. Carter was miles away, locked in the back of a police car, powerless to help. At the police station, Malik sat in a small, cold room with nothing but a table and 2 chairs. His wrists were sore from the handcuffs, and his mind was racing with thoughts of the patient he had left behind. He could feel the minutes slipping away, each one dragging him further from the chance to save a life. Officer Riley had stepped out of the room, leaving Malik alone in silence. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the weight of the situation bore down on him harder than before. He glanced at his watch. Time was running out. He couldn't shake the image of the young man lying on the operating table, his heart struggling to beat. Suddenly, the door swung open, and Riley re-entered the room, a smug grin still plastered on his face. "Well, Dr. Carter," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Looks like we'll be here a little longer." Malik didn't respond. He had already explained who he was. He had told them about the surgery. He had tried reasoning with them, and none of it had mattered. They had ignored his words, brushed aside his identity, and now a life was hanging in the balance because of their negligence. Just as Riley was about to speak again, the door opened once more. This time, it was Officer Thompson, holding a file and looking far more serious than before. His usual stoic demeanor was gone, replaced by something that looked like uncertainty. "Riley," Thompson said quietly, motioning for him to step outside. "We need to talk." Riley's smirk faltered for a second, but he followed Thompson out into the hallway. Malik watched as the door closed behind them, leaving him in silence again, but something felt different. There was a tension now, a shift in the air that Malik couldn't quite place. In the hallway, Thompson handed Riley the file, his voice low but urgent. "We made a mistake," he said, the words coming out slowly, as though he couldn't quite believe them himself. Riley frowned, flipping through the file without much interest. "What are you talking about?" "He's just another—" "No," Thompson interrupted, his tone sharper now. "He's not. Look at the file." Riley glanced down at the papers, his eyes skimming over the information. For the first time, the arrogant expression on his face faltered. He flipped through the documents more carefully now, his brow furrowing in confusion. "He's a surgeon," Thompson continued. "A renowned one. Dr. Malik Carter. He's on the news. He's been featured in medical journals. He's the real deal." Riley's face paled slightly as the reality of the situation began to sink in. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath. He glanced at the door where Malik was waiting, then back at the file in his hands. The weight of their mistake pressed down on him, and for the first time, he seemed to realize the gravity of what they had done. "We need to release him," Thompson said, his voice firm. "Now." Riley hesitated. His mind raced, trying to find a way to justify what had happened, but the evidence was right in front of him. There was no way out. He had arrested a highly respected surgeon for no reason other than his appearance, and now a patient's life hung in the balance because of it. Back in the interrogation room, Malik sat with his head in his hands. He had tried to stay calm throughout this ordeal, but now, knowing how much time had passed, panic was starting to set in. He had never felt so helpless in his life. He was a man of action, someone who saved lives, not someone who sat on the sidelines while others suffered. The door creaked open, and Riley and Thompson walked back in. This time, there was no smirk on Riley's face. Instead, there was a strained look of regret. "Dr. Carter," Riley began, his voice more subdued than before. "There's been a misunderstanding." Malik's jaw tightened. A misunderstanding. That's what they were calling it. A life was at stake, and they were trying to sweep this under the rug as a simple misunderstanding. But before he could respond, Riley continued. "We've confirmed your identity, and we understand now that you're a surgeon. We're going to release you immediately." Malik didn't respond right away. His mind was focused entirely on the hospital. The surgery. The patient. He needed to get out of here, now. "I need my phone," Malik said, his voice low but steady. "I need to call the hospital." Riley quickly nodded, gesturing for Thompson to hand him the phone. Malik grabbed it with trembling hands, dialing the hospital's number as quickly as he could. His heart pounded in his chest as he waited for someone to pick up. St. Andrew's Hospital, came the familiar voice of a nurse on the other end. "This is Dr. Malik Carter," he said, his voice sharp with urgency. "I need to speak to Dr. Santos in the OR immediately." There was a brief pause, then the sound of the line being transferred. Malik held his breath, his mind racing with the possibilities of what could have happened in the time he had been detained. "Malik." Emily's voice crackled through the line. "Where the hell are you? We're losing him." Malik's heart sank. "I'm on my way," he said quickly. "Start without me. I'll be there as fast as I can." "We already started," Emily said, her voice strained. "But it's bad, Malik. We need you." "I'll be there," Malik repeated, the words more of a promise to himself than to her. He hung up the phone and turned to the officers. "I need a ride to the hospital," he said firmly. Riley and Thompson exchanged a glance. They both knew what they had done, and at this point, the least they could do was help. Riley nodded. "We'll take you." Without another word, the officers led Malik out of the room and toward their squad car. As they sped through the city streets, Malik's mind was already on the surgery. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he knew he had to do everything in his power to save that young man's life. The car skidded to a halt in front of the hospital, and Malik was out of the car before it had even fully stopped. He sprinted through the hospital doors, his heart pounding, praying that he wasn't too late. The doors to the hospital swung open as Malik rushed inside, his heart racing not just from the sprint, but from the dread of what he might find. His white coat flared behind him as he moved through the halls, ignoring the startled glances of the staff. Nurses and doctors alike paused to watch him pass, recognizing the intensity in his eyes. He had no time for explanations. Every second counted. Emily Santos was already deep into the procedure when Malik burst through the doors of the operating room. The tension in the room was palpable. The steady beeping of the heart monitor was erratic, and the surgical team looked strained, their faces drawn tight with concentration. Emily glanced up briefly when Malik entered, relief flooding her face, but it was short-lived. "Where the hell have you been?" she demanded, though her focus never wavered from the patient in front of her. "I'll explain later," Malik said breathlessly as he quickly scrubbed in, his hands moving with the practiced speed of someone who had done this countless times. "What's his status?" Emily shook her head grimly, her voice strained. "It's bad. His vitals are all over the place." "I did what I could, but I'm not." "You did fine," Malik interrupted gently, moving beside her. "I've got it from here." Emily stepped back, her face a mixture of exhaustion and relief. She had been holding the team together, trying to buy time until Malik arrived. Now, with the pressure finally off her, she exhaled deeply, though her eyes stayed on the patient. Malik's hands moved with precision, his eyes focused solely on the delicate work in front of him. His mind shut out everything else, the events of the day, the injustice, the anger, and narrowed down to the task at hand. The patient's heart was in a fragile state, and every movement he made had to be exact. "Scalpel," he said, his voice steady. The nurse handed him the instrument, her hands trembling slightly from the intensity of the situation. The beeping of the heart monitor filled the room, and for a brief moment, there was silence as the team watched Malik work. The nurses held their breath, and Emily stood by, silently praying for a miracle. They all knew how close the patient had come to death. It had been a race against time, and they had almost lost. Malik's face was calm, but inside, he was fully aware of the stakes. This was the type of procedure that required his full attention, and his delay, had put this young man's life in jeopardy. He couldn't let that happen. Not now. "Steady," Malik murmured to himself as he made another incision. The tension in the room was palpable, but he remained focused. This was what he had trained for. This was what he did best. The minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity, until finally, Malik took a deep breath and stepped back from the operating table. "It's done," he said, his voice low but firm. The room seemed to exhale all at once. The heart monitor, once erratic, now beeped at a steady rhythm. The patient was stable, and for the first time since Malik had arrived, there was a sense of relief. Emily wiped her brow with the back of her arm, exhaustion settling in. "I don't know how you do it," she muttered, shaking her head. Malik gave her a tired smile, but his eyes were already shifting toward the clock. They had saved the patient, but barely. If he had arrived just a few minutes later. "We were close," he said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Too close." Emily nodded, not needing to say anything more. They both knew how precarious the situation had been. The surgical team began the process of cleaning up, the tension in the room slowly dissipating. But for Malik, the events of the day still weighed heavily on him. As he removed his gloves and stepped out of the operating room, the reality of what had happened outside these hospital walls hit him again. He had been late, not because of traffic or some scheduling error, but because of an injustice, a misunderstanding that could have cost a young man his life. Outside the OR, Mrs. Johnson was pacing nervously in the waiting room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her chest. Her heart leapt when she saw Malik walk toward her, still dressed in his scrubs, the weariness evident on his face. "Dr. Carter," she called, rushing toward him. Did you?" Malik gave her a reassuring nod. "He's stable now. The surgery was a success, but it was close." Tears filled Mrs. Johnson's eyes as she grasped his hands in gratitude. "Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for saving my boy." Malik nodded, but the weight of her words sat heavily on him. The truth was, he had almost failed her son, not because of his skill, but because of the world outside this hospital. A world where he had been judged not for his abilities, but for the color of his skin. "I'm just glad I made it in time," he said quietly, though the words felt hollow. Mrs. Johnson didn't notice the strain in his voice. She was too overwhelmed with relief, her prayers answered, her son given a second chance. But Malik's mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the thought of what had almost happened. He couldn't forget how powerless he had felt, sitting in the back of that police car, knowing that his absence could mean the end for someone depending on him. The sun was beginning to set as Malik stepped outside the hospital, the cool evening air offering a stark contrast to the sterile, tension-filled environment he had just left behind. The surgery was over, the patient was stable, but the events of the day lingered in his mind like a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. His hands were steady now, but his heart was not. He couldn't stop replaying the moment when the police officers had shoved him against his own car, their words echoing in his head, "You fit the description." It was a phrase he had heard too many times in his life, and each time, it stung just as deeply. Today, it had almost cost someone their life. As he stood on the hospital steps, the enormity of the situation began to settle in. His mind raced with a flood of emotions, anger, frustration, but also a profound sense of injustice. Malik had always known that racism was a persistent force in the world, but today it had crossed a line that he couldn't ignore. Not anymore. He looked out over the busy streets, watching the cars pass by, people going about their lives, oblivious to the turmoil that had nearly unfolded just a few hours ago. Malik had been on the verge of losing everything he had worked for, his reputation, his career, and, most importantly, his patient. All because of a routine traffic stop turned nightmare. Pulling out his phone, he dialed a number he hadn't used in a while. As the phone rang, he could feel the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him. After a few moments, a familiar voice answered on the other end. "Malik." It was his lawyer, David Mitchell, an old friend and a civil rights attorney who had represented Malik in other disputes over the years. "I need to talk," Malik said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Something happened today. And it can't be swept under the rug." David paused on the other end. He could tell from Malik's tone that this wasn't just a casual conversation. "What happened?" Malik took a deep breath and recounted the events of the day, from the moment the police officers stopped him, to the arrest, to the near-fatal delay in the surgery. As he spoke, the memories of the incident became sharper, more vivid, and the injustice of it all felt like a wound that refused to heal. When he finished, David's voice was measured but firm. "This is serious, Malik. You were detained without cause, and someone's life was put at risk because of it. We need to take action." "I'm not looking for revenge," Malik said quickly. I can't let this happen again. Not to me, not to anyone. If I wasn't a doctor, if I didn't have people waiting for me, they would have gotten away with it. And next time, someone might not be so lucky." David was silent for a moment, letting Malik's words sink in. "I understand. And you're right. We need to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug. You're a respected surgeon, Malik. People are going to pay attention to this. If we file a lawsuit, we can force them to reckon with what happened." Malik nodded, though David couldn't see him. He had known from the moment he stepped out of that police car that this couldn't end here. The anger, the humiliation, it was too much to ignore. But it wasn't just about him. It was about all the people who didn't have the platform or the privilege to fight back. "Okay," Malik said finally. "Let's do it." "I'll start the paperwork," David replied. "But Malik, you should be prepared. This could get ugly. The police department isn't going to admit fault easily, and the public backlash could be intense." Malik clenched his jaw, already bracing himself for what was to come. He knew this wouldn't be easy. The system wasn't built to hold itself accountable, and he had seen firsthand how these situations could spiral out of control. But this time, he wouldn't let it go. He couldn't. "I'm ready," Malik said, though part of him wondered if anyone could ever truly be ready for a fight like this. After hanging up, Malik stood there for a moment, letting the weight of his decision settle over him. He had spent his entire career saving lives, staying out of the political fray, and focusing on his work. But now, it seemed, life had pulled him into a battle he hadn't asked for. A battle he couldn't avoid. As he walked back into the hospital to check on his patient, the halls felt quieter than usual. His colleagues gave him nods of respect as he passed, but Malik could see the curiosity in their eyes. Word had spread quickly. People knew something had happened, though they didn't know the details yet. But we need the support of this community, of people everywhere who believe in justice and equality. Together, we can make sure that what happened to Dr. Carter never happens again. As the press conference wrapped up, Malik stepped away from the podium, his heart pounding. The adrenaline was still coursing through his veins, but a new sense of purpose had taken root. This wasn't just a personal battle anymore, it was a movement. And he was ready to lead it. Afterward, a few reporters approached Malik, asking for more details, but David quickly ushered him away from the crowd. "You did great out there," David said, clapping Malik on the shoulder. Malik nodded, though his mind was still spinning from everything that had just happened. "What now?" he asked, his voice quieter now that the adrenaline was fading. "Now, we fight," David replied. "This is just the beginning." As Malik walked away from City Hall, the weight of what lay ahead settled over him. There would be pushback. The police department wouldn't take this lying down. There would be smear campaigns, legal battles, and public scrutiny. But Malik knew one thing for sure, he wasn't going to back down. Not this time. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind. News outlets picked up the story, and soon it was everywhere: TV, social media, newspapers. Dr. Malik Carter, a renowned surgeon, wrongfully detained by the police while en route to save a life. The headlines practically wrote themselves, and with them came the flood of public outrage. But alongside the outrage came the backlash. As David had predicted, the police department wasn't going to take this lying down. They issued their own statement, downplaying the incident and claiming that the officers had acted within protocol, following what they called reasonable suspicion. Malik sat in his office at the hospital, staring at the statement on his computer screen. The words made his blood boil. Reasonable suspicion. It was the same excuse used time and time again to justify racial profiling, to excuse the mistreatment of black men and women across the country. He had known this was coming, but seeing it in writing only solidified his resolve. There was a knock on his office door, and when it opened, Emily Santos walked in, her face a mixture of concern and frustration. She held up a tablet, the police department's statement displayed on the screen. "Have you seen this?" she asked, closing the door behind her. Malik nodded. "Yeah. I've seen it. They're trying to spin it," Emily said, her voice filled with disbelief. "They're making it sound like you were some kind of threat, like they had every right to arrest you." "They're protecting themselves," Malik replied, his voice calm but tight. "They always do." Emily sat down across from him, her eyes searching his face. "Are you okay? I mean, with all of this? I know the press has been relentless, and the hospital board has been asking questions," Malik exhaled, leaning back in his chair. The pressure was mounting from all sides. The media frenzy, the legal battles, the hospital's concerns about its reputation, it was all starting to weigh on him. But he couldn't let that stop him. Not now. "I'm fine," he said, though the exhaustion was creeping into his voice. "This has to be done, Emily. If I don't fight this, nothing will change." She nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of his decision. "I know. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I just don't want you to burn out. You're one of the best surgeons we have, Malik. The hospital needs you. Your patients need you." Malik appreciated her concern, but he had already made up his mind. "This isn't just about me. It's bigger than that." Emily gave him a soft smile, recognizing the determination in his eyes. "Well, for what it's worth, I'm with you. Whatever you need." "Thank you," Malik said, his voice sincere. "I might need to take you up on that." After Emily left, Malik returned his focus to the lawsuit. David had been working tirelessly, gathering evidence, deposing witnesses, and preparing for what was sure to be a drawn-out legal battle. Malik knew that this case wasn't going to be quick or easy. The police department had powerful allies, and they would do everything in their power to discredit him, to paint him as the aggressor rather than the victim. But Malik wasn't afraid of the fight. He had faced challenges before, both in his career and in his life. Growing up, he had watched his parents struggle against systemic racism, working twice as hard to provide opportunities for him and his siblings. Those experiences had shaped him, given him the strength and resilience he needed to succeed in a world that wasn't always welcoming to men like him. Now, that same strength was what fueled him in this fight. This wasn't just about his own experience, it was about standing up for everyone who had been mistreated, profiled, or unjustly detained. It was about forcing the system to change, even if that change came slowly. Later that evening, Malik sat at his kitchen table, papers strewn across the surface as he prepared for a deposition with David the next day. The sound of his phone vibrating on the table broke his concentration, and when he picked it up, he saw his mother's name on the screen. "Hi, Mom," he answered, leaning back in his chair. "Malik," his mother's warm voice came through the line, but there was a hint of worry in it. "I've been watching the news. Are you doing okay?" Malik smiled at the sound of her voice. His mother had always been his biggest supporter, but she also worried about him constantly, especially now. "I'm okay, Mom. Just busy." "You're doing the right thing, you know that, right?" she said softly. "I know it's hard, but you're making a difference." Malik nodded, though she couldn't see him. "I know. It just feels like there's so much at stake." "There is," his mother agreed. "But that's why you can't give up. Your father and we raised you to fight for what's right, even when it's hard. And I know he would be proud of you." Her words hit Malik harder than he expected. His father had passed away years ago, but his influence had never left. He had been the one to teach Malik about standing up for himself, about navigating a world that didn't always see his worth. And now, Malik could only hope he was living up to those lessons. "I'm trying, Mom," Malik said, his voice quiet. "I really am." "I know you are," she replied. "And I'm here for you, no matter what happens." Malik thanked her and said good night, feeling a little lighter after their conversation. His mother's words had a way of grounding him, reminding him why he was fighting this battle in the first place. It wasn't just about one bad encounter with the police, it was about changing the way people like him were treated every day. The next morning, Malik met David at the law office for their deposition preparation. As they went over the case, reviewing every detail and piece of evidence, Malik felt a sense of purpose settle over him. This was more than just a legal fight, it was a fight for dignity, for respect, and for justice. And no matter how long it took, Malik was ready. Months had passed since Malik and David filed the lawsuit against the police department. The legal battle had been exhausting, both mentally and emotionally. Malik had spent countless hours in depositions, recounting the events of that day over and over again. The police department fought back at every turn, denying any wrongdoing and attempting to shift the blame onto Malik. They claimed he had been uncooperative and hostile, even though the video evidence captured by a bystander painted a very different picture. But through it all, Malik had remained steadfast. His resolve never wavered, even when the pressure became overwhelming. He was fighting for more than just himself, he was fighting for justice, for accountability, and for the countless others who had been mistreated in similar ways. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the case was coming to a close. The courtroom was packed, reporters and onlookers filling every available seat as the judge prepared to deliver his ruling. Malik sat beside David, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been through so many high-stakes moments in his life or death surgeries, split-second decisions, but this was different. This was about his dignity. About being seen. The judge cleared his throat and looked over the courtroom. After reviewing the evidence, including video footage and testimonies, it is clear that the police officers involved acted improperly in their handling of Dr. Malik Carter's detainment. There is sufficient evidence to support the claim of racial profiling, and therefore, I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff. A wave of relief washed over Malik, but he kept his expression calm. This was what they had been fighting for, and now they had won. The police department had been found guilty of racial profiling, and Malik's reputation had been restored. The court orders the immediate suspension of the officers involved, pending further investigation, and awards damages to Dr. Carter for emotional distress and lost wages, the judge continued. It was a victory, but Malik couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a partial one. Yes, the officers had been suspended, and the court had ruled in his favor, but the underlying issues that allowed this to happen in the first place still remained. The system itself had not changed. The ruling was a step forward, but there was still so much work to be done. As the judge adjourned the court, David turned to Malik, a triumphant smile on his face. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with satisfaction. "This is huge, Malik. You've set a precedent." Malik nodded, but his mind was already moving past the courtroom. "Yeah," he said quietly. "But this is just the beginning." David frowned slightly, sensing Malik's hesitation. "What do you mean?" "We won." "We won this case," Malik replied, his voice steady but thoughtful. "But this isn't over. There are still people out there, people who don't have the resources or the platform that I do, who are going through this every day. This ruling doesn't fix that." David's smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. He understood what Malik was saying. The ruling was a victory, but it didn't change the system. It didn't prevent this from happening to someone else tomorrow or the next day. Malik had won his battle, but the war against systemic racism and injustice was far from over. "You're right," David said, nodding slowly. "But this is a start. You've opened the door for others to follow." As they stood to leave the courtroom, reporters rushed toward Malik, microphones thrust in his direction, cameras flashing. David tried to shield him from the chaos, but Malik stepped forward, ready to address the press. "Dr. Carter, how do you feel about the ruling?" one reporter shouted over the crowd. Malik took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the sea of faces before him. "I'm grateful for the court's decision today," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But I want to be clear, this isn't just about me. This is about a much larger issue. This is about the countless men and women who face this kind of discrimination every day, who don't have the means to fight back." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "This ruling is a step in the right direction, but it's not the end. We need real, systemic change. We need to hold our institutions accountable and ensure that no one else has to go through what I did. I won't stop fighting until that happens." The crowd of reporters erupted in more questions, but Malik wasn't interested in answering them. He had said what he needed to say. The cameras continued to flash as David guided him away from the reporters and out of the courthouse. Outside, the air was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere inside. Malik took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past few months slowly lift off his shoulders. But even as he felt a sense of relief, he knew that the journey was far from over. This victory was just the first step in a much larger fight. As they walked down the courthouse steps, a small group of supporters gathered nearby began to applaud. Malik looked over at them, recognizing some of the faces from the protests and rallies that had sprung up in support of his case. They had stood by him, marched for him, and now they were celebrating with him. One of the supporters, a young man wearing a t-shirt that read, "Justice for All," approached Malik with a shy smile. "Dr. Carter," he said hesitantly. "I just wanted to thank you. For standing up. For fighting back. You're giving us hope." Malik smiled warmly, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "But this isn't just my fight. It's all of ours." The young man nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "We'll keep fighting." Malik nodded in return, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The ruling was a victory, but it wasn't enough. There was still so much work to be done, and Malik was ready for it. He wasn't just a surgeon anymore, he was an advocate, a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. As he walked away from the courthouse, Malik knew that his life had changed forever. The fight for justice was far from over, but he was ready for whatever came next. 6 months had passed since the court ruling, and though the legal battle had ended, the echoes of the fight continued to reverberate through Malik's life. The lawsuit had sparked a wave of conversations about racial profiling and police accountability, not just in his city, but across the country. Malik had become a symbol, a reluctant one, perhaps, but a symbol nonetheless, for justice and reform. Sitting in his office at the hospital, Malik gazed out the window, watching the sun set over the skyline. His desk was cluttered with case files and medical journals, but his mind wasn't on his next surgery or his research. It was on the movement he had helped ignite, the changes that had begun to take shape. The police department had implemented new training programs, and 2 of the officers involved in his case had been dismissed. Small steps, but significant ones. The door to his office opened, and Emily Santos stepped in, a soft smile on her face. "You've got a full day tomorrow," she said, holding up a schedule. "But I wanted to see how you're doing." Malik looked at her and smiled. "I'm doing okay," he said honestly. "Busy, but okay." Emily nodded, sensing the weight behind his words. "You've done a lot, you know. More than most people could have. You've changed things." Malik leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. "It still feels like there's so much more to do. I know the lawsuit was a victory, but it doesn't feel like enough." Emily sat down across from him, her gaze steady. "Change takes time, Malik. What you've started, what we've all started, it's going to have ripple effects. You may not see all of them now, but they're there. People are paying attention. Things are shifting." Malik nodded, appreciating her words but still feeling the weight of the work ahead. He had been thrust into this role as an advocate, and while it wasn't something he had ever expected, it was now a part of who he was. He couldn't just walk away from it. The system was broken, and it needed people like him to keep pushing for change. "I guess I'm just tired," Malik admitted, running a hand over his face. "It feels like I'm fighting on so many fronts, being a doctor, an advocate, trying to balance it all." Emily smiled knowingly. "You're allowed to be tired. But don't forget, you're not in this alone. You have people supporting you. People who believe in what you're doing." Malik smiled back, the exhaustion in his body momentarily easing. "Thanks, Emily. I needed that." After she left, Malik stood up and walked over to the window. The city below was alive with lights, a reminder that life moved on, no matter how heavy the burden felt. He thought about the patient he had saved that day, Tyler Johnson. The young man had made a full recovery and was now back in school, his life continuing, his future bright. Malik had visited him a few times since the surgery, each visit reminding him of what was at stake. It wasn't just about the fight for justice in the courts or the streets. It was about the people whose lives were affected every day by the decisions of those in power. It was about the mothers waiting in hospital corridors, praying for their sons to come home. It was about the young men and women who were too often seen as threats rather than individuals with dreams and futures. Malik's phone buzzed on his desk, interrupting his thoughts. He picked it up and saw a message from David. "David, we've got another case. This one is big. Call me when you can." Malik stared at the message for a moment, feeling the familiar pull of responsibility. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But as tired as he was, he knew he couldn't turn away. Not now. Not ever. He texted back a quick reply and placed the phone on the desk. There would always be more cases, more battles to fight. But there would also be victories, moments when the system was forced to acknowledge its flaws and make changes, however small. And those moments were worth it. They were what kept him going. Malik returned to his desk, shuffling through the papers scattered across it. He had patients to see tomorrow, surgeries to perform, lives to save. But he also had a larger mission, one that would follow him beyond the walls of this hospital. He glanced at a photograph on his desk, a picture of his father, smiling proudly beside a much younger Malik on the day of his medical school graduation. His father had always been his greatest inspiration, pushing him to be better, to rise above, to fight for what was right. Hope is not passive, his father had once told him. It's something you work for, something you build with every choice you make. Those words echoed in Malik's mind now, as they often did. He had chosen to fight. He had chosen to use his voice and his platform to push for change, even when it was hard, even when it felt like the world was against him. And in the end, that was what mattered. As the city lights twinkled outside his window, Malik felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him. The journey ahead would be long, but he wasn't afraid of it. He had come this far, and he would keep going. For his father. For his community. For the patients who depended on him, and for the future that he was determined to shape. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles. But tonight, Malik allowed himself a moment of reflection, of gratitude, and of hope. Because in the end, hope was what would carry him through.
If you like this story, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on the next stories that will be posted soon. Thanks for watching, folks. See you on the next video.